David Parker's hands trembled as he approached table 7, the bird steak hidden beneath a silver cloche. He had no idea the woman sitting there was Miranda Caldwell, the food critic who could destroy restaurants with a single review. What happened next would not only save his job, but transform the entire city's restaurant scene in ways no one could have imagined. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The dinner rush at Murphy's Diner had been particularly brutal that Tuesday evening. Steam rose from the bustling kitchen where orders flew back and forth like ammunition in a war zone. David Parker wiped sweat from his brow as he balanced 3 plates on one arm, his black dress shirt clinging to his back, despite the October chill seeping through the restaurant's old windows. At 32, David had the weathered look of someone who had faced more challenges than his years suggested, with calloused hands that spoke of countless shifts spent serving tables and washing dishes when the dishwasher called in sick. His mind wandered to his 8-year-old son Jake, who was probably finishing his homework at the babysitter's house 6 blocks away. David had promised to pick him up by 9, and with the way tonight was going, he might be cutting it close again. The guilt gnawed at him, like hunger on an empty stomach. Single parenthood had never been part of his plan, but when his wife Sarah died in a car accident 3 years ago, David's world had collapsed and rebuilt itself around one simple truth. Everything he did now was for Jake. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floors that had seen better decades. Murphy's wasn't the kind of place food critics typically visited. It was a neighborhood institution, the kind of establishment where regulars knew each other's names, and the coffee was always hot, even if it wasn't always good. The red vinyl booths had been patched with duct tape more times than anyone could count, and the jukebox in the corner still played songs from the 1980s, though half the buttons didn't work anymore. David had been working at Murphy's for 2 years, ever since he lost his construction job when the housing market took a downturn. The pay wasn't great, barely enough to cover rent on their tiny 2-bedroom apartment and Jake's after-school care. But it was steady work, and Murphy himself was understanding when David needed to leave early for parent-teacher conferences or when Jake got sick. In a world that often felt like it was moving too fast, Murphy's represented something solid, something David could count on. As he delivered the 3 plates to table 4, David noticed a woman sitting alone at table 7 near the window. She was probably in her mid-40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and wearing a navy blue blazer that looked expensive. Her posture was perfect, spine straight, as she reviewed what appeared to be notes on her phone. There was something about her that seemed out of place in Murphy's casual atmosphere, like a symphony conductor who had wandered into a garage band rehearsal. The woman had ordered the New York strip steak, medium rare, with a side of roasted vegetables and mashed potatoes. It was one of Murphy's signature dishes, though David knew that signature at Murphy's meant it was edible and filling rather than award-winning. Still, the kitchen usually managed to get the steaks right, and Chef Rodriguez took pride in his grilling technique despite working with equipment that had seen better decades. David made his way back to the kitchen to check on table 7's order. The familiar chaos greeted him. Rodriguez shouting orders in rapid-fire Spanish, the dishwasher Marcus jamming to music through earbuds while plates clattered in the industrial sink, and the fryer spitting oil like an angry cat. The air was thick with the smell of grease, onions, and the perpetual coffee that kept everyone functioning through double shifts. "Order up for table 7, Rodriguez called out, sliding a plate across the steel counter. David grabbed it without looking, his mind already calculating the rest of his tables and wondering if he'd make enough in tips tonight to buy Jake the new sneakers he needed for gym class. It wasn't until he was halfway to table 7 that he lifted the cloche for a final check and felt his stomach drop to his shoes. The steak was burnt, not just well done, not just a little overcooked, but genuinely charred around the edges with black grill marks that looked like tire tracks. The meat had the texture of leather and probably tasted like it too. David stopped dead in his tracks, nearly colliding with another waiter carrying a tray of drinks. His first instinct was to march back to the kitchen and demand Rodriguez fix it, but a glance at the clock showed 8:15. He was already cutting it close to pick up Jake, and if he sent this back, it would take another 20 minutes, minimum. David looked toward table 7 where the woman sat patiently, occasionally glancing at her phone and making notes. She hadn't complained about the wait, hadn't flagged him down with impatient gestures like some customers did. There was something almost regal about her patience, as if she was accustomed to being waited on but too polite to make a scene about it. Maybe, David thought desperately, she wouldn't notice. Maybe she was one of those people who doused everything in steak sauce anyway. With sweaty palms and a prayer to whatever deity looked after struggling single fathers, David approached table 7. "Your New York strip, medium rare?" he announced, setting the plate down with as much confidence as he could muster. The cloche clinked against the ceramic, and David held his breath as the woman looked down at her meal. Miranda Caldwell had been food critic for the Metropolitan Herald for 15 years. She had closed restaurants with scathing reviews and launched careers with glowing recommendations. Her palate was legendary, her standards impossibly high, and her reputation for fairness matched only by her reputation for brutality when restaurants failed to meet her expectations. She had eaten in Michelin-starred establishments in Paris, hole-in-the-wall noodle shops in Tokyo, and food trucks in Austin that served better barbecue than restaurants charging $50 a plate. She was not supposed to be at Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday night in October. Her assistant had booked her a table at Chez Laurent, the new French bistro that was generating buzz among the city's culinary elite. But a last-minute cancellation had left Miranda with an unexpected free evening, and she had decided to drive around the neighborhoods she rarely visited, looking for the kind of authentic local dining experiences that sometimes produced her most memorable reviews. Murphy's had caught her eye precisely because it looked unremarkable. The faded sign, the mismatched chairs visible through the window, the handwritten specials board that advertised meatloaf and apple pie. These were the places where real cooking sometimes happened, where recipes were passed down through generations, rather than designed by committee and focus groups. Miranda looked down at the plate before her and felt her eyebrows rise involuntarily. The steak was beyond well done, charred to the point where she could smell the burnt meat from where she sat. The vegetables looked acceptable, and the mashed potatoes appeared to be real rather than instant. But the centerpiece of the dish was essentially inedible. She glanced up at the waiter who had served it, noting the nervous energy radiating from him like heat from a radiator. David stood frozen beside the table, watching Miranda's face for any reaction. She hadn't said anything yet, hadn't called him over to complain or demanded to speak to the manager. She simply stared at the steak with an expression David couldn't read. The silence stretched between them like a tight rope, and David felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the restaurant's modest temperature. "Is everything all right with your meal?" David finally managed to ask, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I mean, how does everything look?" Miranda looked up at him, studying his face with the same intensity she had applied to the burnt steak. David was young, probably early 30s, with kind eyes that held the particular exhaustion she associated with people juggling multiple responsibilities. His uniform was clean, but showed signs of wear, and there was something in his posture that suggested he was bracing for bad news. "The steak appears to be somewhat overcooked," Miranda said carefully, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated at good schools and accustomed to choosing her words precisely. She didn't want to humiliate this young man, who clearly hadn't intended to serve her leather disguised as beef. David felt his face flush hot with embarrassment and panic. "I am so sorry," he said quickly, reaching for the plate. "Let me take this back to the kitchen right away. Chef Rodriguez will have a new one out for you in 20 minutes, maybe 15 if he's not too backed up with orders." "Wait," Miranda said, placing her hand gently over David's as he reached for the plate. Her touch was cool and reassuring, and something in her tone made David pause. "Before you do that, can I ask you something?" David nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He was probably about to be reported to Murphy, maybe even fired. He could already see Jake's disappointed face when David had to explain why they might need to move again, why David would be spending even more time job hunting instead of helping with homework. "How long have you been working here?" Miranda asked. 2 years, David replied automatically. "Almost 2.5, actually. Do you enjoy it?" The question caught David off guard. Most customers who complained about their food didn't engage in small talk with the staff. They demanded satisfaction, compensation, or the manager, usually in that order. David found himself looking into Miranda's eyes, which were a warm hazel that seemed genuinely interested in his answer. "I need it," David said honestly. "I've got a son, and this job lets me be home with him most mornings and get him off to school. The hours work with his schedule, and Murphy's good about letting me switch shifts when Jake needs me for something important." Miranda nodded slowly, processing this information. "What's your son's name?" "Jake. He's 8. David's voice softened the way it always did when he talked about his boy. "He's in 3rd grade, loves dinosaurs, and building things with blocks. Kid's got an imagination that won't quit." "And it's just the two of you?" David hesitated, wondering why this stranger was asking personal questions when she should be complaining about her ruined dinner. "His mom died 3 years ago, car accident, so yeah, it's just us now." Miranda felt something shift in her chest, a familiar ache she associated with stories of loss and resilience. She had built her career on maintaining professional distance, on evaluating restaurants based solely on the food and service they provided. But sometimes, the human element crept through her carefully constructed walls, reminding her that behind every meal was a story. Behind every restaurant was a family trying to make their way in the world. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "That must be incredibly difficult." David shrugged, the gesture carrying years of practice at deflecting sympathy he didn't know how to handle. "We manage. Jake's a good kid, makes it easier somehow. Kids are resilient, you know? Sometimes I think he handles it better than I do." Miranda looked back down at the burnt steak, then at David's face, then around the diner where other families sat sharing meals that weren't perfect but were served with care by people doing their best. She made a decision that surprised her, one that went against 15 years of professional training and personal policy. "David," she said, reading his name tag. "I need you to sit down." "I'm sorry, what?" David blinked in confusion. "Ma'am, I can't sit down during my shift. Murphy's got rules about that, and I've got other tables to take care of." "Just for a moment," Miranda insisted. "Please. I have something to tell you, and I think you'll want to be sitting down when you hear it." Against his better judgment, David slid into the booth across from Miranda. The vinyl was cracked in places, and the table wobbled slightly when he rested his arms on it. Around them, the diner continued its evening rhythm. Coffee cups clinking against saucers, quiet conversations mixing with the sounds from the kitchen, the occasional burst of laughter from the counter where regulars gathered to solve the world's problems over pie and coffee. Miranda reached into her purse and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the table to David. He picked it up and read, "Miranda Caldwell, Food Critic, Metropolitan Herald." David's eyes widened as the implications hit him like a freight train. "You're Miranda Caldwell," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the diner's ambient noise. "You're the food critic, the one who closed down Francesca's last month with that review about the soggy pasta and surly service." "I am," Miranda confirmed. "And you just served me what is arguably the worst steak I have encountered in my 15-year career. Under normal circumstances, this would result in a review that would likely put Murphy's Diner out of business within 6 months. David felt the world tilt sideways. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, his knuckles turning white against the worn formica surface. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Please don't write about this. I know the steak was terrible. I know I should have sent it back. But if Murphy's closes, I don't know what I'll do. I can't afford to be unemployed again, and Jake needs stability. He's already lost so much." "Tuss." Miranda watched David's face cycle through panic, desperation, and finally a resigned acceptance that broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. She had seen restaurant owners plead for mercy, had listened to chefs make excuses and promises they had no intention of keeping. But this was different. This wasn't about ego or profit margins. This was about a father trying to provide for his son in a world that didn't make it easy. "David," she said gently, "I'm not going to write a negative review about Murphy's." Relief flooded David's face, followed quickly by confusion. "You're not?" "No, I'm not. But I am going to write about tonight, about this conversation, about what I've learned here. Would that be all right with you?" David stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "I don't understand. You're going to write about Murphy's, but not a bad review?" Miranda smiled, and for the first time since sitting down, she cut a small piece of the burnt steak and took a bite. She chewed thoughtfully, her expression neutral, then swallowed with what David could only describe as determination. "This steak is terrible," she said matter-of-factly. "It's overcooked to the point of being inedible, and under normal circumstances, I would send it back without hesitation. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they?" David shook his head, still confused about where this conversation was heading. "I've eaten in restaurants all over the world," Miranda continued. "I've had meals that cost more than most people make in a week, and I've had street food that cost less than a cup of coffee but tasted like pure joy. I thought I had experienced everything the culinary world had to offer, but I've never had a meal served by someone who needed the job as much as you need this one. I've never eaten food prepared by people who show up to work, not because they love what they do, but because they love the people they're doing it for." She took another bite of the steak, wincing slightly but continuing to chew. "This steak is burnt, David, but the story behind it, the reason you served it despite knowing it wasn't right, that tells me everything I need to know about Murphy's Diner. This isn't a place that's trying to impress food critics or win awards. This is a place where real people come to work so they can take care of their families. That's worth more than perfect food." End quote. David felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "I still don't understand what you're going to write." Miranda reached across the table and placed her hand over David's again. "I'm going to write about a diner where the steak might be overcooked, but the heart behind the service is perfect. I'm going to write about a place where a single father works double shifts so his 8-year-old son can have stability and security. I'm going to write about Murphy's Diner, where the food feeds your body and the people feed your soul." End quote. The impact of her words hit David like a physical force. He had been prepared for disaster, for unemployment, for having to uproot Jake's life once again. Instead, he was being offered something he had never experienced before. Recognition not for perfection, but for perseverance. "Why?" he asked simply. Miranda considered the question, looking around the diner at the other servers hustling between tables, the families sharing meals that probably represented a significant expense in their monthly budgets. The worn but clean surfaces that spoke of people who took pride in their work, even when the work was difficult. "Because," she said finally, "I've spent 15 years reviewing restaurants, and I've forgotten that food is about more than just taste and presentation. It's about nourishment, not just of the body, but of the community. It's about people coming together, about families being able to afford a meal out occasionally, about workers being treated with dignity even when they make mistakes." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've closed restaurants for serving food that wasn't up to my standards. And I never thought about the servers who lost their jobs, the cooks who had to find new work, the families who depended on those paychecks. Tonight, you reminded me that behind every meal is a human story, and sometimes that story is more important than whether the steak is cooked perfectly." End quote. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring if other customers saw. "What happens now?" "Now," Miranda said, cutting another piece of the burnt steak and eating it with apparent determination. "I finish my meal, you continue taking care of your other tables, and tomorrow I write a column that I hope will remind my readers about what really matters when we dine out." She looked at her watch, noting it was nearly 8:30. "Don't you need to pick up Jake soon?" David's eyes widened. "Yes, I do. Murphy closes the kitchen at 9, so I usually leave right after that to get him from the babysitters. But I can't leave you here with this terrible steak, David," Miranda said firmly. "Go take care of your son. I'll settle up with whoever's working the register, and I'll be perfectly fine finishing my meal." "Are you sure? I mean, you're Miranda Caldwell. I should at least get you a dessert or something to make up for the steak." "Ah." Miranda laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did David. "You know what? I'll take a piece of pie, whatever Murphy's is famous for. Not because I expect it to be perfect, but because I want to complete the experience of dining at a place where the food might not always be flawless, but the intentions always are. David scrambled out of the booth, his relief and gratitude making him slightly clumsy. The apple pie is really good. Murphy's wife made the recipe, and she's been baking them here for 20 years. I'll get you a piece with ice cream. As David hurried toward the kitchen, Miranda pulled out her phone and began typing notes for her column. She wrote about burnt steak and perfect service, about second chances and single fathers, about the difference between restaurants that fed the body and those that nourished the soul. She wrote about Murphy's Diner, where she had learned that sometimes the most important ingredient in any meal is the story of the people who prepare and serve it. David returned with a generous slice of apple pie, topped with vanilla ice cream, the crust golden brown, and the apples still warm from the oven. "This one's on the house," he said, setting the plate before Miranda. "And thank you for everything you said, for what you're going to write. Jake's going to be so excited when I tell him I met a famous food critic and that she thought his dad was doing okay." Miranda tasted the pie and closed her eyes appreciatively. It was exactly what pie should be: simple, honest, made with care rather than pretension. "David," she said, "tell Jake that his dad is doing more than okay. Tell him his dad is a hero, the kind who shows up every day and does whatever it takes to take care of the people he loves. That's the best kind of hero there is." After David left to collect Jake, Miranda finished her PI slowly, savoring not just the taste, but the atmosphere of Murphy's Diner. She listened to conversations at nearby tables, watched the easy familiarity between the staff and regular customers, observed the way people lingered over coffee, not because the coffee was exceptional, but because the place made them feel welcome. When she finally left Murphy's that night, Miranda knew she was about to write the most important review of her career. Not because the food was extraordinary, but because the experience had reminded her why food criticism mattered in the first place. It wasn't about perfect technique or innovative presentations. It was about celebrating places where people gathered to share meals and stories, where families could afford to treat themselves occasionally, where workers were valued for their humanity rather than just their efficiency. The next morning, David arrived at Murphy's early to help with the breakfast prep, as he did every Wednesday. He had told Jake about meeting the famous food critic, and his son had been impressed that his dad had served food to someone so important. Jake had asked if the lady had liked the food, and David had explained that sometimes the most important thing wasn't whether the food was perfect, but whether the people serving it cared about the people eating it. Murphy himself was already at the diner when David arrived, sitting in his usual booth with coffee and the morning papers spread before him. Murphy was in his 60s, a stocky man with gray hair and hands that showed the wear of 40 years in the restaurant business. He looked up as David entered, and there was something in his expression that made David's stomach clench with worry. "David," Murphy said quietly, "we need to talk." David's mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. Someone had complained about the burnt steak. Miranda Caldwell had changed her mind and written a scathing review after all. Murphy's was closing, and David was being fired. He sat down across from his boss, bracing himself for disaster. Murphy folded the newspaper and turned it toward David. The headline on the food section made David's breath catch in his throat. "At Murphy's Diner, imperfect food serves perfect humanity." "Read it," Murphy said simply. David's hands shook as he lifted the newspaper. Miranda's column filled the entire page, accompanied by a photograph of Murphy's exterior that somehow made the modest diner look warm and inviting, rather than simply worn down. The review began. "Last night, I experienced something that reminded me why I became a food critic in the first place. It wasn't the perfect execution of a complicated dish or the innovative fusion of unexpected flavors. It was a burnt steak served by a single father who needed his job more than I needed. Perfect food. In a diner where the real nourishment comes not from the kitchen, but from the human connections that make a restaurant more than just a place to eat." End quote. Miranda had written about David without using his name, describing him simply as a server whose dedication to his family had taught her more about hospitality than years of dining at award-winning restaurants. She wrote about Murphy's as a neighborhood institution where the food might not always be flawless, but the intentions always were. She described the apple pie as a perfect example of the kind of honest, unpretentious cooking that reminds us why we fell in love with food in the first place. The column concluded with a paragraph that would become legendary in the city's restaurant community. Murphy's Diner will never earn a Michelin star, and they shouldn't want to. What they offer is something more valuable. A place where families can afford to celebrate, where workers are valued for their humanity rather than just their efficiency, where the burnt steak you might occasionally receive is outweighed by the warmth of people who genuinely care about your experience. In an industry obsessed with perfection, Murphy's Diner reminds us that sometimes imperfection served with love is exactly what we need. David looked up at Murphy, whose weathered face was struggling to contain what appeared to be several conflicting emotions. "So," Murphy said finally, "you want to tell me about this burnt steak?" David told the story, from his panic about being late to pick up Jake, to his decision to serve the overcooked steak rather than send it back, to his shock at discovering he had served Miranda Caldwell potentially the worst meal of her career. Murphy listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or shaking his head. "You know what the crazy part is?" Murphy said when David finished. "Rodriguez showed me that steak after he plated it, told me it was burnt, asked if he should start over. I told him to send it out because we were backed up, and the customer had been waiting. So really, it was my fault. Much as yours." David stared at his boss. "You're not firing me?" Murphy laughed, a sound David rarely heard from the usually gruff restaurant owner. "Kid, you just got Murphy's Diner, the best review in the Metropolitan Herald in 20 years. Fire you? I'm thinking about giving you a raise." Over the next few days, Miranda's column had an impact that surprised everyone, including Miranda herself. The newspaper's website crashed briefly from the volume of readers sharing and commenting on the article. Social media buzzed with discussions about the difference between perfect food and perfect service, about supporting local businesses that valued their workers, about the importance of understanding the human stories behind every meal. More significantly, Murphy's Diner found itself busier than it had been in years. Customers came not expecting gourmet cuisine, but hoping to experience the kind of authentic, caring service Miranda had described. They came looking for the server who had inspired such a powerful column, wanting to support a business that clearly valued its employees as more than just labor. David found himself something of a local celebrity, though the attention made him uncomfortable. He hadn't intended to become a symbol of anything. He had simply been trying to do his job and take care of his son. But people approached him with stories of their own struggles, their own efforts to balance work and family, their appreciation for places like Murphy's that understood that life was complicated and sometimes imperfect. Good enough. The increased business meant more tips, which allowed David to buy Jake those new sneakers and even start putting a little money aside each month. More importantly, it meant job security at a time when David had been worried about Murphy's ability to stay afloat in an increasingly expensive city. 2 weeks after the column was published, Miranda returned to Murphy's. She came on a Thursday evening when the dinner rush was winding down, taking the same table where she had sat 2 weeks earlier. This time, she ordered the meatloaf, Murphy's other signature dish, and made sure David was her server. "How are things?" she asked when David approached her table. "Different," David admitted. "Good different, but still different. We've been busier than I've seen this place in years. People come in asking about the burnt steak story, wanting to know if I'm the server from your column. How does that feel?" David considered the question. "Weird, mostly. I mean, I appreciate what you wrote, and I'm grateful for when it's meant for business here. But I didn't do anything special. I just served you dinner and told you about my son." Miranda smiled. "David, that's exactly what made it special. You were authentic, honest, human. In a world where customer service often feels scripted and impersonal, you treated me like a person rather than just another table to turn. That's rarer than you might think." The meatloaf, when it arrived, was perfectly prepared. Tender, flavorful, served with real mashed potatoes and green beans that had been cooked just until tender. Miranda ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the atmosphere of Murphy's, which had retained its neighborhood charm despite the increased attention. "I have a proposition for you," Miranda said as she finished her meal. David looked at her curiously. "What kind of proposition?" "I've been thinking about doing a series of columns about restaurants like Murphy's. Places where the food might not be fancy, but the story behind it is compelling. I'd like you to be my guide, to help me find these places and understand what makes them special." David blinked in surprise. "You want me to help you write restaurant reviews?" "I want you to help me remember what I learned here," Miranda corrected. "That the best restaurants aren't always the ones with the most talented chefs or the most expensive ingredients. Sometimes they're the ones where people care about each other, where the food serves a purpose beyond just satisfying hunger." David thought about the offer. "I don't know anything about food criticism." "You know about people," Miranda replied. "You know about working hard for the people you love, about showing up even when things are difficult, about finding dignity in honest work. Those are the stories I want to tell." The collaboration between Miranda and David became one of the most popular features in the Metropolitan Herald. Once a month, they would visit a different neighborhood restaurant, usually a family-owned establishment that had been serving its community for decades without seeking attention or acclaim. Miranda would evaluate the food with her trained palate, but David would talk to the staff, learn their stories, understand what the restaurant meant to the people who worked there and the customers who kept it alive. Their columns celebrated diners where retired factory workers gathered every morning for coffee and conversation, food trucks that provided affordable meals to construction workers and office employees, family restaurants where multiple generations worked side by side to preserve traditional recipes and hospitality. They wrote about places where the food might not always be perfect, but the human connections were genuine, where customers were treated like neighbors rather than revenue streams. The series, which Miranda titled Heart and Soul, won several journalism awards and was eventually compiled into a book that became a bestseller. But more importantly, it changed the way people in their city thought about dining out. Restaurants began emphasizing the stories of their workers, the history of their establishments, the connections they fostered within their communities. The focus shifted, gradually but noticeably, from pure culinary achievement to the broader question of what made a restaurant truly valuable to the people it served. For David, the success of the collaboration meant financial stability he hadn't known since before Sarah's death. The book advance and speaking fees from the occasional food industry conference allowed him to move Jake to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood, closer to a school with strong academic programs and after-school activities. More importantly, it gave David a sense of purpose beyond simple survival, a feeling that his experiences as a struggling single father had value beyond his own family. Jake, now 9 years old, had grown proud of his father's unexpected fame. He would tell classmates that his dad was a food critic, though David always corrected him to explain that he was more of a storyteller who happened to write about restaurants. Jake had even accompanied David and Miranda on a few of their restaurant visits, charming staff and customers with his enthusiasm for trying new foods and his innocent observations about what made places feel welcoming. On the first anniversary of Miranda's original column about Murphy's, the Herald organized a celebration at the diner itself. Murphy had agreed to close the restaurant for the evening, hosting a party for the newspaper staff, regular customers, and local restaurant owners who had been featured in the Heart and Soul series. The mayor attended, declaring it Murphy's Diner Day, and presenting Murphy with a proclamation recognizing the restaurant's contribution to the city's cultural landscape. David stood near the kitchen, watching the celebration unfold around him, and marveling at how much his life had changed because of a burnt steak. Jake sat at the counter, sharing war stories with Rodriguez about the worst orders they had ever seen, while Murphy held court at his usual booth, telling anyone who would listen about the night the famous food critic had eaten his worst steak and somehow turned it into the best thing that had ever happened to his restaurant. Miranda found David during a quiet moment, stepping away from the crowd that had gathered around the dessert table where Murphy's wife was serving her famous apple pie. "Any regrets?" she asked. David considered the question seriously. His life was busier now, more complicated in some ways. He had responsibilities beyond just serving tables and taking care of Jake. People recognized him on the street occasionally, expected him to have opinions about restaurants and food trends. Sometimes he missed the simplicity of his old routine, the anonymity of being just another server in a city full of them. But then he thought about Jake's new school, where his son was thriving academically and socially. He thought about the stories they had told through the Heart and Soul series, the restaurants they had helped people discover, the workers whose dedication they had celebrated. He thought about the financial security that allowed him to say yes when Jake asked if they could go to the movies or buy a new book, rather than always having to calculate whether they could afford it. "No regrets," David said finally. "Though I still can't believe it all started with burnt steak." Miranda laughed. "You know what I'd learned from all this? Sometimes the best things happen not because we planned them, but because we're willing to be honest about our imperfections. You could have lied about that steak, made excuses, blamed the kitchen. Instead, you told me the truth about why you served it, and that truth changed everything." As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, David helped clean up the diner, working alongside Rodriguez and Marcus and the other staff members who had become more than just co-workers over the years. They were family, bound together by shared shifts and mutual support, by the understanding that they all showed up each day not just for paychecks, but for each other. Jake had fallen asleep in one of the booths, exhausted from the excitement of the evening and the late hour. David carried his son to the car, marveling at how much heavier Jake had gotten, how much taller he was becoming. In a few years, Jake would be a teenager, then a young adult making his own way in the world. David hoped he was teaching his son the right lessons about work and family, about showing up even when things were difficult, about finding value in honest effort even when the results weren't perfect. As they drove home through the quiet streets, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 3 years ago, he had been a widowed father, struggling to rebuild his life around the reality of single parenthood. 2 years ago, he had taken a job at Murphy's Diner out of desperation, needing work that would accommodate Jake's schedule and his limited skills. 1 year ago, he had served a burnt steak to a stranger and discovered that sometimes our worst moments can become our best opportunities. Now, he was part of something larger than himself, a voice for working families and neighborhood institutions that rarely received recognition for their contributions to their communities. He had helped change the conversation about what made restaurants valuable, shifting focus from pure culinary achievement to the human connections that gave food meaning beyond mere sustenance. The impact of Miranda's original column and their subsequent collaboration had rippled far beyond the city limits. Restaurant associations in other cities had invited them to speak at conferences, sharing their perspective on authentic hospitality and community-centered dining. Culinary schools had begun incorporating discussions about the social responsibility of food service into their curricula, encouraging future chefs and restaurant managers to consider not just the quality of their food but the welfare of their employees and the needs of their communities. Food Network had approached them about developing a television show based on the Heart and Soul concept, though David had ultimately declined, feeling that the intimacy of their written stories might be lost in the binary translation to television. He preferred the quiet conversations with restaurant workers, the unhurried meals that allowed them to truly understand the culture of each establishment they visited. Television, with its need for drama and quick pacing, seemed antithetical to the patient observation that had made their work meaningful. Jake had started showing interest in cooking, inspired by the countless restaurant kitchens he had observed during their travels. He would spend Saturday mornings at Murphy's, helping Rodriguez prep vegetables and learning basic knife skills under careful supervision. The chef had taken the boy under his wing, teaching him not just techniques, but the importance of treating ingredients with respect, of taking pride in even the simplest preparations. "Your papa, he understands something most people don't," Rodriguez had told Jake one morning as they worked side by side. "Food is not just about taste. It's about caring for people, about making them feel welcome and valued. That's what makes a good cook, not just knowing how to make things taste good." David watched his son absorb these lessons with the same intensity Jake had once reserved for dinosaur facts and building block instructions. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing Jake develop an appreciation for the work David did, understanding it as more than just a job, but as a form of service to others. The financial success of their book had allowed David to establish a small scholarship fund for children of restaurant workers who wanted to attend culinary school or pursue hospitality education. The fund wasn't large enough to transform lives dramatically, but it had helped several young people take first steps toward careers in food service. Armed with an understanding that their work could be both economically viable and socially meaningful. One recipient was Maria Santos, whose mother had worked as a line cook in a family restaurant featured in one of their columns. Maria had used the scholarship to attend a community college program in restaurant management, and she had recently opened her own small cafe that employed other single mothers, offering flexible schedules and childcare assistance. She had written to David, explaining that his story had shown her that success in the restaurant industry didn't have to mean compromising her values or abandoning her responsibilities as a parent. Stories like Maria's reminded David that their work had created a ripple effect he was still learning to comprehend. Each column had reached thousands of readers, many of whom had their own complicated relationships with work and family, their own struggles to find dignity and purpose in jobs that society often overlooked or undervalued. By telling his story and the stories of other restaurant workers, they had given voice to experiences that were common but rarely acknowledged in public discourse. Murphy himself had become something of a local celebrity, though he handled the attention with characteristic gruffness tempered by genuine pride. The diner had been featured in tourism guides and food blogs, attracting visitors from other cities who came specifically to eat at the place where Miranda Caldwell had her revelation about the value of imperfect food, served with perfect intentions. The increased business had allowed Murphy to give raises to his longtime employees and hire additional staff, reducing the workload for everyone. He had also invested in some modest upgrades to the kitchen equipment, though he had resisted suggestions to renovate the dining room, insisting that Murphy's charm lay in its unpretentious authenticity. "People don't come here for fancy decorations," Murphy had explained to a reporter who asked about his plans for the restaurant. "They come here because it feels like home, because they know we're not trying to be something we're not. You start changing too much, you lose what made people want to come here in the first place." This philosophy had become central to the heart and soul approach that David and Miranda had developed. They sought out restaurants that had maintained their identity despite external pressures to modernize or standardize, places where the food reflected the culture and values of the people who prepared it, rather than current trends or market research. Their travels had taken them to a Polish pierogi shop run by a grandmother who still made everything by hand, rolling each dumpling with techniques learned from her mother in Krakow. They had written about a barbecue joint in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, where the pitmaster had been smoking meat using the same wood and spice blend for 30 years, creating a gathering place where community elders shared stories with young families over plates of ribs and cornbread. They had discovered a Vietnamese restaurant operated by refugees who had fled their country in the 1970s, bringing recipes that had sustained their families through immigration and adaptation to a new culture. The pho served there wasn't just soup, it was a connection to homeland, a way of preserving identity while building new lives in an unfamiliar place. Each story had taught David something new about resilience, about the ways people used food to maintain connections to their past while creating stability for their future. He had learned that restaurants were often more than businesses. They were cultural institutions, community centers, symbols of the American dream, pursued by people willing to work 18-hour days to build something lasting for their families. The success of their work had also brought unexpected challenges. David sometimes felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of representing working-class families in the food industry, worried that his words might not adequately capture the complexity of their experiences. He had received letters from restaurant workers who felt his story was too optimistic, who pointed out that not everyone had the opportunity to transform a mistake into a career change. These criticisms weighed on David, reminding him that his good fortune was not entirely due to his own efforts, but also to circumstances beyond his control. Miranda had chosen to see his story in a positive light. Another critic might have focused solely on the burnt steak and poor service. Murphy had been understanding about David's family obligations. Another employer might have seen them as liability rather than asset. David had addressed these concerns in several of their columns. acknowledging that his experience, while genuine, was not universal. He had written about restaurant workers who struggled with inflexible schedules, inadequate wages, and employers who viewed them as easily replaceable. He had used his platform to advocate for better working conditions throughout the food service industry, supporting initiatives for paid sick leave, predictable scheduling, and living wages. The advocacy work had connected David with labor organizers and policy experts who were working to improve conditions for service workers across various industries. He had testified at city council hearings about proposed minimum wage increases, sharing his story as evidence that supporting working families was not just morally right, but economically beneficial for BIA, businesses, and communities. These experiences had given David a broader understanding of the systemic issues that made his own journey both more remarkable and more necessary. He had learned that individual success stories, while inspiring, were not sufficient to address the structural problems that kept too many families trapped in cycles of economic insecurity. Miranda had been instrumental in helping David navigate this tension between personal narrative and social criticism. Her experience as a journalist had taught her how to tell individual stories in ways that illuminated larger truths without overwhelming readers with statistics and policy arguments. "People connect with stories," she had explained to David during one of their planning sessions. They remember the bird's steak, the single father worried about being late to pick up his son, the moment when understanding replaced judgment. Those details give them a framework for thinking about bigger issues. The goal isn't to solve everything in one column, but to help people see familiar situations in new ways. This approach had made their work accessible to readers who might have been intimidated by traditional policy discussions or academic analyses of economic inequality. By focusing on specific people in particular moments, they had made abstract issues concrete and personal. The book tour had taken David to cities across the country, where he had met restaurant workers facing similar challenges in different contexts. He had spoken with servers in tourist destinations who struggled with seasonal employment, cooks in college towns whose wages barely kept pace with rent increases driven by student populations, and family restaurant owners in small communities where economic development had bypassed Main Street in favor of highway strip malls. Each conversation had reinforced David's understanding that his story, while unique in its resolution, was common in its fundamental elements. Across the country, people were working multiple jobs to support their families, making difficult choices between financial necessity and family time, finding dignity and purpose in work that society often dismissed as temporary or unimportant. These encounters had also shown David the power of representation in media and public discourse. Many of the people he met had never seen their experiences reflected in mainstream publications or recognized as worthy of serious attention. The simple act of treating restaurant work as legitimate subject matter for thoughtful journalism had been validating for workers who were accustomed to being invisible in discussions about economic policy or social trends. Jake had accompanied David on several of these trips, experiencing parts of the country he would never have seen otherwise. The travel had broadened his perspective in ways David hoped would serve him well as he grew older and began making his own decisions about work and life. During a visit to a family restaurant in rural Montana, Jake had spent an afternoon helping the owner's daughter with her homework, while David and Miranda conducted interviews. Later, Jake had asked David why the restaurant was so much emptier than Murphy's, leading to a conversation about economic opportunity and geographic inequality that was more sophisticated than David would have expected from a 9-year-old. "It's not fair that some places have more customers just because of where they are," Jake had observed. "The food was really good, and the people were nice. They worked just as hard as everyone at Murphy's." These insights from Jake reminded David that their work was not just about documenting the present, but potentially influencing the future. Jake's generation would inherit the economic and social structures that currently shaped opportunities for working families. By exposing Jake to these realities, while he was still forming his understanding of fairness and justice, David hoped to raise a son who would work toward a more equitable society. The second anniversary of Miranda's original column was approaching, and both David and Miranda had been reflecting on what they had learned from their collaboration. The work had changed both of them in ways they were still discovering. For Miranda, The partnership with David had restored her sense of purpose as a food critic. She had rediscovered the social responsibility inherent in her platform, the power to influence not just where people chose to eat, but how they thought about the relationship between food and community. Her reviews had become more holistic, considering not just culinary technique, but labor practices, community impact, and cultural significance. For David, the experience had provided a new vocabulary for understanding his own life and the lives of people around him. He had learned to articulate the value of service work, to see connections between individual struggles and systemic issues, to use his story as a bridge between different social and economic classes. Their publisher had approached them about writing a second book, this one focusing specifically on policy solutions that could improve conditions for restaurant workers while supporting the community institutions that employed them. The project would require extensive research and collaboration with economists and policy experts, representing a significant expansion of their work beyond storytelling into advocacy and analysis. David was both excited and intimidated by the prospect. The success of their first book had given them a platform and credibility they could use to influence policy discussions, but it also carried the responsibility to get the details right, to propose solutions that were both compassionate and practical. "We don't have to have all the answers," Miranda had reminded him, "but we have an obligation to ask the right questions, to make sure that policy discussions include the voices and perspectives of the people who will be most affected by the decisions." As David tucked Jake into bed on the night before the second anniversary celebration at Murphy's, his son asked a question that had been weighing on David's mind as well. "Dad, do you think things are really getting better for people like us?" David considered how to answer honestly, without overwhelming his son with adult concerns. "I think more people understand now that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, no matter what kind of work they do. I think there are more people trying to make things fairer. But it's a big problem, and it's going to take time to fix." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Like when you're building something with blocks, and you have to be careful, or it falls down?" "Exactly like that," David agreed. "You have to build it piece by piece, make sure each card is strong before you add the next one." As Jake drifted off to sleep, David sat in the small living room of their apartment, looking through the latest batch of letters from readers of their column. Some shared their own stories of struggling to balance work and family. Others described restaurants in their communities that embodied the values David and Miranda had written about. And a few were from young people who had been inspired to consider careers in food service because they had seen it portrayed as meaningful work rather than just a temporary job. Each letter reminded David that their work had reached beyond the immediate goal of improving business at Murphy's or advancing their own careers. They had participated in a larger cultural conversation about work and dignity, about the value of service industries and the people who made them function. They had helped shift perceptions, even if only incrementally, toward greater recognition of the skills and dedication required for restaurant work. The next morning, as David prepared for the anniversary celebration, he received a call from Murphy. The old man's voice carried an excitement David had rarely heard from him. "You need to get down here early today," Murphy said. "There's something I want to show you before the party starts." When David arrived at the diner, he found Murphy standing beside a new plaque mounted near the entrance. It read, "Murphy's Diner, established 1978, where food feeds the body and community feeds the soul. In recognition of our commitment to treating every customer as family and every employee as valuable." Below the main text, in smaller letters, it continued, "Dedicated to all the servers, cooks, dishwashers, and family members who have made Murphy's a gathering place for our neighborhood. Their dedication and care are the real ingredients in every meal we serve." David felt his eyes water as he read the inscription. In all their travels and interviews, in all the recognition their work had received, nothing had meant as much as this acknowledgement from Murphy, the man who had given him a job when he needed it most, and had supported his family through the most difficult period of their lives. "This is beautiful," David said, "but you didn't need to do this." Murphy shrugged, his habitual gruffness unable to completely hide his emotion. "Seemed like the right thing to do. All this attention we've been getting, people coming in because of what you and that critic lady wrote. I wanted to make sure everyone knew it wasn't about me." It was about all of us. Everyone who's ever worked here. Everyone who's ever made this place feel like home for somebody. As the anniversary celebration began that evening, David looked around Murphy's with new appreciation for what they had all built together. The diner was packed with familiar faces. Regular customers who had been coming for years, staff members past and present, local business owners who had been featured in the FI, Heart and Soul series, and newspaper colleagues who had supported their work. Miranda gave a speech, thanking Murphy for his hospitality and acknowledging the role the diner had played in transforming her understanding of food criticism. She spoke about the responsibility that came with the power to influence public opinion, about the importance of recognizing that behind every meal was a network of human relationships that extended far beyond the transaction between customer and server. When it was David's turn to speak, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all together. 2 years earlier, he had been focused entirely on survival, on making it through each shift and each day with enough energy and resources to take care of Jake. He had not imagined that his life could become a platform for broader discussions about work and family, about dignity and community. "I want to thank everyone who made tonight possible," David began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded diner. "But most of all, I want to thank Murphy for creating a place where people like me could find not just employment, but belonging. Where mistakes were met with understanding rather than punishment. Where family obligations were seen as responsibilities to be supported rather than problems to be managed." He paused, looking around at the faces gathered in the small restaurant. "I've learned over these past 2 years that the story Miranda wrote wasn't really about a burnt steak or even about me. It was about the thousands of people who work in restaurants like this one, who show up every day and do their best to take care of customers and each other. It was about the customers who understand that when they dine out, they're not just buying food, they're participating in a community." As the evening continued, David found himself in conversation with a young woman who had recently graduated from culinary school and was considering her career options. She had read their book and attended the celebration because she wanted to understand how to build a restaurant career that aligned with her values. "I want to cook," she explained. "But I also want to work somewhere that treats people well, that pays fair wages and respects work-life balance. Do places like that actually exist, or is that just idealistic thinking?" David smiled, remembering asking similar questions when he first started at Murphy's. "They exist, but sometimes you have to create them. Sometimes it means being willing to work at places that aren't perfect but are trying to do better. Sometimes it means being the person who asks the hard questions about how your workplace treats its employees." He thought about the restaurants they had profiled in their column, the ones that had impressed him not with their culinary innovation, but with their commitment to creating positive work environments. "The best places I've seen are usually the ones where the owners have worked in kitchens themselves, where they remember what it feels like to be on your feet for 12 hours or to worry about making rent. They understand that taking care of employees isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business." The conversation reminded David that their work had the potential to influence not just public perception, but industry practices. Young people entering food service careers were reading their columns and book, forming expectations about how they should be treated by employers. Restaurant owners were being asked by employees about their commitment to work-life balance and fair compensation. As the celebration wound down, and, quote, the last guests departed, David helped clean up the diner one more time, working alongside the same staff members who had become his extended family. The work felt comfortable and familiar, a return to the routine that had sustained him through difficult times, and now provided stability as he navigated new opportunities. Jake had fallen asleep in a booth again, worn out by the excitement of the evening and the late hour. As David prepared to carry his son to the car, Murphy approached with an envelope. "This is for Jake," Murphy said. "For his college fund. It's not much, but every kid should have the chance to choose their own path." Inside the envelope was a check for $5,000, money David knew Murphy couldn't easily spare. The gesture embodied everything David had come to appreciate about Murphy's leadership. Practical support offered without fanfare, understanding that taking care of employees meant taking care of their families. "You don't need to do this," David protested. "I want to," Murphy replied simply. "That boy's spent a lot of time here, helped out when he could, been patient when you had to work late. He's part of the Murphy's family too." As David drove home through the quiet streets, Jake sleeping peacefully in the passenger seat, he reflected on the community they had built around Murphy's Diner and the larger community their work had helped create through the Heart and Soul series. What had started as a single father's mistake had become a movement, small but meaningful, toward recognizing the dignity and value of service work. The future remained uncertain in many ways. The restaurant industry was facing challenges from rising costs, labor shortages, and changing consumer preferences. The broader economy continued to create obstacles for working families, despite the increased awareness their work had helped generate. But David had learned something important about the relationship between individual action and social change. He had discovered that telling his story, honestly, without trying to make it more dramatic or inspiring than it actually was, had given other people permission to value their own experiences and advocate for their own needs. The burnt steak that had terrified him 2 years ago had become a symbol of the grace that was possible when people chose understanding over judgment. When they looked past immediate disappointments to see the human circumstances that shaped every interaction, Miranda's decision to respond to his mistake with curiosity rather than criticism had created ripple effects that were still expanding, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways they were only beginning to understand. As David tucked Jake into bed for the second time that evening, his son mumbled sleepily, "Dad, are we going to keep writing about restaurants?" "As long as people want to read the stories," David replied. "As long as there are good stories to tell." "I think there always will be," Jake said with the certainty of childhood, "because there are always going to be people working hard to take care of other people." David kissed his son's forehead and turned off the light, carrying Jake's words with him as he prepared for another day at Murphy's Diner, where the coffee would be hot, the service would be caring, and the community would continue to grow one meal at a time. 3 months later, David received a call that would once again reshape his understanding of how far their influence had spread. The voice on the other end belonged to Senator Patricia Williams, chairwoman of the Senate Subcommittee on Labor and Employment. She had read their book and followed their column religiously, and now she was inviting David to testify at congressional hearings about proposed legislation to improve working conditions for service industry employees. "Your story has resonated with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle," Senator Williams explained during their phone conversation. "You've given a human face to policy discussions that too often get bogged down in statistics and partisan talking points. We need voices like yours to help Congress understand what these issues mean for real families." The invitation both honored and terrified David. Speaking at city council meetings was one thing, but testifying before Congress felt impossibly daunting for someone who had started this journey as a nervous waiter trying not to get fired. Yet he understood that this opportunity represented exactly what Miranda had encouraged him to embrace: the chance to use his experience to advocate for systemic changes that could benefit countless other working families. Miranda helped him prepare for the testimony, working with him to craft remarks that would be both personal and policy-focused. They spent hours discussing how to translate his individual experience into broader recommendations about minimum wage laws, healthcare access, and scheduling regulations that could make meaningful differences in the lives of service workers across the country. "Remember," Miranda coached him during one of their preparation sessions, "you're not there as an expert on labor economics or policy implementation. You're there as someone who has lived these challenges, who can help lawmakers understand the human impact of their decisions. Your strength is in the authenticity of your experience." End quote. The night before his flight to Washington, David sat with Jake at their kitchen table, helping with homework while his own notes for the testimony lay scattered nearby. Jake had grown accustomed to his father's increasing involvement in advocacy work, but the significance of testifying before Congress seemed to impress even his pragmatic 9-year-old. "Are you nervous?" Jake asked, looking up from his math worksheet. "Terrified," David admitted. "But sometimes you have to do scary things because they might help other people." Jake considered this wisdom with the seriousness he brought to most adult conversations. Like when you served that bird steak to Miss Caldwell? David laughed, struck by the parallel his son had drawn. Exactly like that. Sometimes the scary thing turns out to be the right thing, even when you can't see it at the time. The congressional hearing room was more intimidating than David had imagined. The high ceilings, formal atmosphere, and rows of cameras created an environment that seemed designed to overwhelm rather than welcome testimony from ordinary citizens. As David took his seat at the witness table, he reminded himself of Miranda's advice. He was here not to impress anyone with policy expertise he didn't possess, but to share truth about experiences that were invisible to most of the people who would vote on the legislation under consideration. His testimony lasted 12 minutes and covered the challenges of balancing work schedules with family responsibilities, the financial stress of living paycheck to paycheck despite working full-time hours, and the importance of workplace policies that recognized employees as whole human beings rather than just labor units. He spoke about Murphy's as an example of how treating workers well could benefit both employees and businesses, creating loyalty and community that enhanced rather than hindered profitability. The questions from committee members revealed the divide David had expected. Some senators seemed genuinely interested in understanding how policy changes might improve conditions for working families, asking detailed questions about specific challenges he had faced and solutions he had observed in workplaces he had written about. Others appeared more focused on defending existing business practices, suggesting that regulations would burden employers and ultimately harm the workers they were intended to help. These senators asked pointed questions about whether David's success story proved that the current system already provided adequate opportunities for advancement. David handled these questions with the same honesty that had characterized his original conversation with Miranda. "My story is real," he said. "But it's also unusual. Most people who serve burnt steaks to food critics don't end up writing books or testifying before Congress. The system shouldn't depend on extraordinary luck or unusual circumstances to provide basic dignity and security for working families." End quote. The exchange that would later be highlighted in news coverage came when Senator Robert Hawkins, known for his opposition to labor regulations, suggested that David's success undermined arguments for policy changes. "Mr. Parker," Senator Hawkins said, "your story is certainly inspiring. But doesn't your success prove that America already provides opportunities for hardworking people to improve their circumstances?" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "Senator, my story proves that opportunities can exist. But it also proves how random and rare they are. I didn't succeed because I worked harder than other single parents in similar situations. I succeeded because a food critic chose to see my humanity instead of can. Just my mistake. Because my boss valued loyalty over perfection. Because a series of coincidences aligned in ways they don't for most people." He leaned slightly forward, making eye contact with Senator Hawkins. "The question isn't whether some people can overcome difficult circumstances with luck and help. The question is whether we want to build a system that requires luck or one that provides basic fairness as a starting point." The clip of this exchange went viral on social media, shared by advocacy organizations and working families who felt David had articulated something they had long believed but hadn't known how to express. The video was viewed millions of times, generating discussions about opportunity, fairness, and the role of government in supporting working families. Following the hearing, David was approached by representatives from several national organizations focused on labor rights and economic justice. They invited him to serve on advisory boards, to speak at conferences, to lend his voice to campaigns for specific policy initiatives. The attention was flattering, but also overwhelming, threatening to pull him away from the restaurant work and community focus that had given his advocacy its authenticity. Miranda, now serving as both collaborator and informal advisor, helped David navigate these requests. They developed criteria for evaluating opportunities. Would the work directly benefit service industry employees? Would it build on David's actual expertise rather than asking him to speak beyond his experience? Would it allow him to maintain his connection to Murphy's and the community that had shaped his perspective? Using these guidelines, David accepted positions on the advisory board of the Restaurant Workers Alliance and the board of directors for Fair Wage Coalition. Both organizations focused specifically on improving conditions for food service employees. He declined invitations that would have required extensive travel or shifted his focus to broader economic issues where his expertise was less relevant. The legislative hearing had an unexpected personal consequence as well. Among the viewers was Rebecca Chen, a documentary filmmaker who had been following labor rights issues for several years. She contacted David about creating a film that would follow the lives of several service industry families, using their stories to explore the challenges and possibilities facing working-class Americans. Rebecca's approach impressed David because she wanted to focus not just on struggles, but on resilience, not just on problems, but on solutions that were already working in some communities. She had studied their Heart and Soul series and understood that the most powerful stories often came from places where people were finding ways to thrive despite systemic obstacles. The documentary project would span 2 years, following David and Jake, as well as families connected to 3 other restaurants they had featured in their column. Rebecca wanted to capture not just individual stories, but the broader community networks that supported working families, showing how restaurants, schools, neighborhood organizations, and informal support systems work together to create stability. Jake was initially skeptical about being filmed for a documentary, worried that his classmates might tease him or that the attention would make their lives more complicated. But when Rebecca explained that the film might help other families facing similar challenges, Jake agreed to participate with the same sense of responsibility that had characterized his response to most aspects of their public platform. The filming process revealed aspects of their daily life that David hadn't fully appreciated. Watching Rebecca document their morning routine, their evening conversations, their weekend visits to Murphy's, David saw their family through an external lens that highlighted both the ordinary and extraordinary elements of their experience. One sequence that would later become central to the film showed Jake helping Rodriguez in the Murphy's kitchen on a Saturday morning, carefully dicing onions while discussing his plans for a school science project. The scene captured the intergenerational mentorship that had become part of Jake's upbringing, the way the restaurant community had stepped in to provide guidance and support that extended far beyond David's individual capabilities as a parent. Another powerful moment occurred when David and Miranda visited a struggling restaurant in a low-income neighborhood. Interviewing staff members who were organizing to demand better working conditions from an unresponsive owner, David found himself in the role of advisor and advocate, using his platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard in discussions about restaurant industry practices. The contrast between Murphy's supportive environment and this exploitative workplace drove home for David how much his positive experience had depended on Murphy's character and values. It reinforced his commitment to policy changes that would extend basic protections to all workers, regardless of whether they were fortunate enough to work for understanding employers. As the documentary filming progressed, David noticed changes in Jake that went beyond the normal development of a growing child. His son was becoming more articulate about social issues, more aware of economic inequality, more confident in expressing opinions about fairness and justice. The exposure to diverse perspectives and communities had broadened Jake's worldview in ways that would serve him well, regardless of what career path he eventually chose. During one filmed conversation, Jake asked David a question that stopped him cold. "Dad, do you think I should work in restaurants when I grow up?" David had expected this question eventually, but hadn't prepared an answer. He believed deeply in the dignity and value of restaurant work, had spent years advocating for better treatment of service industry employees. Yet, like most parents, he wanted his son to have choices, to pursue opportunities that might offer more security and recognition than food service traditionally provided. "I think you should do work that feels meaningful to you," David said carefully. "Work that lets you take care of the people you love and contributes something positive to your community. That might be restaurants, but it could be lots of other things too." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I like cooking, and I like how restaurants bring people together. But I also want to help make things fairer for workers, like you do." The conversation, captured on film, would later resonate with parents across the country who were grappling with similar questions about their children's futures in an economy that often seemed to offer either prestigious careers or meaningful work, but rarely both. The documentary, titled One Meal at a Time, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival 18 months after filming began. The response exceeded Rebecca's expectations, with distribution deals that would bring the film to theaters nationwide and eventually to streaming platforms where it could reach even broader audiences. David attended the premiere with a mixture of pride and nervousness, still adjusting to seeing his family's story presented for public consumption. The film had been edited with sensitivity and respect, but watching their private moments projected for an audience of strangers felt surreal and occasionally uncomfortable. The post-screening discussion revealed the impact the film was already having. Audience members shared stories of their own experiences in service industries, their struggles with work-life balance, their efforts to create more supportive workplace cultures. Restaurant owners in the audience talked about changes they had implemented after reading David and Miranda's work, demonstrating that their advocacy was translating into concrete improvements for workers. One exchange during the question-and-answer session particularly moved David. A young woman identified herself as a server at a chain restaurant who was also attending community college part-time. She explained that watching the film had given her confidence to approach her manager about adjusting her schedule to accommodate her class times. "I used to think I had to choose between work and school," she said. "But seeing your story made me realize that good employers should want to help their employees improve their lives, not just show up for shifts. I asked for what I needed, and it turned out my manager was willing to work with me." Stories like this reinforced David's belief that representation mattered, that seeing working families portrayed with dignity and complexity in media could change both individual expectations and broader cultural attitudes. The film was providing a counter-narrative to stereotypes about service work and the people who performed it, showing viewers that restaurant employees were often resourceful, ambitious, and committed to personal and professional growth. The success of One Meal at a Time brought new opportunities and responsibilities. David was invited to speak at film festivals, participate in panel discussions about labor issues in cinema, and contribute to academic conferences examining the intersection of media representation and, quote, social change. These experiences expanded David's understanding of how storytelling could influence policy and culture. He learned about the research showing that personal narratives were often more effective than statistics at changing public opinion. That individual stories could make abstract issues concrete and relatable for people who hadn't experienced similar challenges. The film's success also attracted attention from political figures who wanted to associate themselves with David's story and the values it represented. He received invitations to appear at campaign events, to endorse candidates, to lend his name to various political initiatives. David approached these requests with caution, understanding that his effectiveness as an advocate depended partly on his perceived independence from partisan politics. He had learned that his story resonated across political divides precisely because it focused on universal concerns about family, work, and dignity rather than ideological positions. After consulting with Miranda and other advisors, David developed a policy of supporting specific legislative initiatives rather than candidates or parties. He would advocate for bills that address service worker rights, regardless of which lawmakers sponsored them, but he would avoid endorsements that might alienate potential allies or reduce his credibility with diverse audiences. This approach proved wise when the Fair Wage Act, legislation partly inspired by David's congressional testimony, came up for consideration in both chambers of Congress. The bill had bipartisan support, but also faced opposition from some business groups, who argued it would burden employers and reduce employment opportunities. David's advocacy for the bill included op-ed pieces, interviews with national media outlets, and meetings with legislators from both parties. His approach emphasized practical benefits for both workers and businesses, rather than partisan talking points, citing examples from restaurants featured in the Heart and Soul series that had prospered while treating employees well. The bill ultimately passed with broader support than many observers had expected, suggesting that David's nonpartisan approach had helped build the coalition necessary for legislative success. The new law wouldn't solve all the challenges facing service industry workers, but it would provide basic protections around scheduling, overtime pay, and workplace safety that could improve conditions for millions of employees. On the day President Martinez signed the Fair Wage Act into law, David watched the ceremony from Murphy's Diner, surrounded by the co-workers and customers who had supported his journey from the beginning. Murphy had closed the restaurant for an hour so everyone could watch together, transforming the dining room into an impromptu celebration space. "You did this," Murphy said to David as they watched the president's remarks on the small television mounted in the corner of the diner. "We all did this," David corrected. "Everyone who shared their stories. Everyone who supported better working conditions. Everyone who proved that treating workers well isn't just the right thing to do, but also good business." Jake, now 10 years old and more articulate about social issues than many adults, raised his hand as if he were in school. "Does this mean other kids won't have to worry as much about their parents working too many hours?" David smiled at his son's question, which captured the human impact of policy changes better than most political commentary. "It means things should be a little bit fairer, a little bit easier for families like ours. There's still more work to do, but this is an important step." As the celebration continued around them, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years had passed since he had nervously served a burnt steak to a mysterious customer, terrified that one mistake might cost him the job he desperately needed. That moment of panic had transformed into something he couldn't have imagined: a platform for advocacy, a career in storytelling, a voice in national conversations about work and dignity. More importantly, it had created a community that extended far beyond Murphy's Diner, connecting them with working families across the country who were building better lives for themselves and their children. The burnt steak had become a symbol of the grace possible when people chose understanding over judgment, when they looked past immediate disappointments to see the human circumstances that shaped every interaction. Miranda's decision to respond with curiosity rather than criticism had created ripple effects that were still expanding, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways they were only beginning to understand. As David prepared to close another chapter of their story and begin whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead, he carried with him the lesson Jake had articulated that evening years ago. There would always be good stories to tell, because there would always be people working hard to take care of other people. In a world that often felt divided and contentious, that simple truth provided both hope and direction for whatever came next.